Mr. Secretary, I know you have travel, and we have one more member to ask questions.
Sure.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Pfluger for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to wave onto this committee. Secretary, good to see you. I want to follow up on a couple of things. Before I get to that, I know you're traveling to China. I hope that will include touting American energy. China has rapidly produced coal plants over the past couple of years. They are concerned about baseload capacity. They are concerned about reality, and yet we have administration officials who are touting the Chinese Communist Party as the leader around the world in combating climate change, which is just incredulous and it's nonsense. So I hope that on your trip there that you'll tout American LNG. If we were to replace the coal plants that China has, we could reduce the CO2 footprint immediately overnight by about 50%. So following up on my colleague here, in your position as special envoy, you made it clear that you do negotiate, on behalf of the president. But let me ask you this: do you have the authority to bind agreements?
No.
Okay, so you're negotiating, and those binding agreements are the responsibility.
They're not binding. They don't become a binding agreement unless they're ratified by the Congress, by the Senate. And it's not a treaty, mind you. It's an executive agreement. So it's binding between that administration but not beyond that. Okay. That doesn't have the force of law and international law.
In this position, do you advise President Biden on energy policy?
In terms of global challenges and U.S. interest, yes.
Did you advise the president in recent months to travel to Riyadh and to ask OPEC to increase production of oil and gas?
No, I did not.
So Secretary Granholm testified before me on my primary committee in Energy and Commerce, and was a little wiggly on whether or not she was the primary advisor on energy policy for this administration.
Well, she is in regards to writ large the energy policy. Sure, she is primary.
I'm glad to hear that answer. And I'm trying to figure out who advised the president to go to Riyadh and ask for an increase in production of oil and gas. Let me ask you this. In previous times where we've had the opportunity to have you before this committee, I've asked the question, do the renewable sources of energy like wind and solar, let's just limit it to those, do they have the ability to provide baseload capacity in this country?
Backup baseload, no, but some primary, they could be part of it. Yep. But can they on their own guarantee that when the wind isn't blowing and the sun ain't shining? No, that we all know.
Well, I think that's good, and I'm glad to hear that, because that's really the fight that we're.
But with battery, there's ways to make that work. Germany is heading to a very high percentage of renewable. Others are.
I'm glad you brought up Germany. I'm actually very concerned about the path the German government has taken.
So are we.
Because this repower plan is completely ignoring nuclear, and instead of having Russian natural gas, which does provide baseload capacity, they're moving in a direction that could put them in a very bad spot with regards to baseload capacity. When we look at the administration's desire, specifically of the EPA, to have a mandate for EVs in this country, and there's a couple of different timelines. How much electricity does the United States use on an annual basis right now?
I don't know exactly where we are right now.
Okay.
I don't think
it's 4,000 terawatts. How much additional demand would we need if we got to, let's just call it 50% EV mandate, 287 million cars on the road?
Probably double.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
That's actually what the Secretary of Energy said. I think it's less than that. But here's my point, is that I've questioned the EPA Director, Regan, Secretary Granholm, Mr. Goffman, other high-ranking officials in the administration, and I don't believe anybody has done the math on this. And so there's multiple balls in the air here when we're talking about energy. And I don't think anybody in the administration has actually, I know nobody has done the math on this, because we can't get a straight answer And so when you go to China and talk to the Chinese about baseload capacity and the power that's required there, I think they're doing the math on it, and they're building coal plants to meet that demand.
Actually, I don't, with all due respect, I know you represent a district that has tremendous wind and the Permian Basin and so forth, and so you have a lot of knowledge of this. But I think there was a recent article showing that it was in fact renewables that kind of helped Texas through the hurdle of this heat because of its reliability and where the energy comes from. But let me just say to you that I think I know the math has been done, and I know that there's a clarity that as the number of electric vehicles go up, as you electrify the country in various ways, you're going to need a lot more power. And that's precisely why the administration is trying to move on the permitting for many of the transmission lines that are essential to being able to get that power out there. So we have about 2,000 gigawatts now of potential power in the queue that is not able to be deployed. So if we can deploy more rapidly, we will fill the void. We will meet the need.
Mr. Chairman, I need 10 seconds. We are going to enter into a crisis in this country if we do not use the resources that are primary sources of energy. I am not an all of the above fan anymore. I am a best of the above fan. And Mr. Secretary, please advocate for the best of the above in this country, which starts with primary sources like liquefied natural gas that come out of the Permian Basin that I represent. And it's critical that we lead in the world, or we will be cold, dark, and
Do you also believe it's critical that they capture the emissions if they're going to make them?
these companies are doing just that. We've reduced emissions, harmful emissions, ones that are listed in the Clean Air Act.
And you believe that can be brought to scale
We have
and
scaled
be
it.
affordable?
We've scaled it in the Permian Basin. We've gone from 1 million barrels a day just 12 or 13 years ago to 5.5 million barrels a day, 43% of the total production in the United States. And in doing that, we have also reduced harmful emissions by over 40%.
Well, that's great. And look, I've had conversations with many of the CEOs of our biggest companies, asking them and trying to get fully knowledgeable about what's doable and what isn't here. The key is, folks, we've got to meet the target of the reduction of emissions that we know will help us avoid the consequences of what's happening. That's the key. And I'm not picking which way it's going to happen. I want to see it happen, and we'll go from there.
Let's use the best of the above. Mr. Chairman, thank you for letting me wave on. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pfluger. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your time today. Thank you for your answers on this committee. We do not approve of engaging in personalities with the witnesses, though it is not a rule. It's not something that we approve of. So you have our
Can I
commitment.
just mention one thing, though, Mr. Chairman?
Absolutely.
And thank you for your stewardship of this hearing, which I really appreciate. Because I didn't get a chance to answer Congressman Waltz, I think it was, whoever was asking about the airplanes.
You have a couple minutes. As long as
No,
you have
just-
time, you have a couple of minutes.
Because it's trivial in my mind, but I want to make it clear because it keeps sort of resurfacing. We are not, I have not, President Biden is not, we are not saying to people, you should not fly. That's not the message. The message is, let's find a way to be able to make sure when we fly, we're not leaving emissions that we can't capture, or we aren't capturing them, or aren't avoiding them in the first place by creating sustainable aviation fuel. So we're looking to technology to help us. And when somebody says, well, you're asking people to sacrifice this and that. No, we don't believe that this transition actually requires sacrifice. We think it will wind up making life better, cleaner, healthier, more secure. Our country will be strengthened with clean energy and some of our own supply that avoids many of these other problems. So, this battle over the airplane or whatever is kind of ridiculous and not relevant to what we're really trying to achieve here. We're not saying to people you shouldn't fly. You should fly, but let's find a way to make sure that's not contributing emissions. Just as when you drive, we don't want to be contributing emissions. Or when you have a building, buildings are a big source of emissions. We have to build them in a way that they're not contributing pollution, which is in effect what it is, in ways that hurts people. So that's our hope, that we can get on to a sort of more serious, how do we solve this problem, which I think is self-evident to anybody who's eyes are open and whose mind is open at the same time.
I appreciate your closing thoughts.
Thank you, sir.
It's just to wrap up a few thoughts for myself. I would say this. I started with some questions myself. I did not get all the answers that I want, but it is important that your office, every congressional office, that they have transparency. It's important that we know what your mission statement is, what you're trying to do on behalf of the American people, whether every American agrees with you or not. It's important for us to know those that are working in your office, what backgrounds they come from, the ways in which individuals are vetted. For me personally, there's various kinds of power that we see the United States of America wielding. When it's hard power, I think it's important that we put the fear of God into those that challenge us. When it's soft power, I think it's important that we look at every way in which that soft power may help Americans thrive or may help our adversaries, our enemies, or those that wish to rise up against us to potentially thrive, and take that accordingly into account. And I hope that you do that. In that, I would just say this. I wish you well on your travels. I wish you safety on your travels. I thank you for your testimony. Other members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witness, and we would ask that you do respond to those in writing. And I will now recognize my colleague here, Mr. Crow.